I want to introduce our wonderful guest today, David Cohen. After graduating from Miami University with a Bachelor of Science degree in business in 1958, David began his career as a life insurance agent and still continues this activity today, although that's not what he's talking about today. In 2002, David wrote his first book, Get What You Want. Since that time, he has written 9 additional books and a play entitled A Couple of Kids Once More, which was showcased at the Clintonville Women's Club. David and his lovely bride, Rita, who is here today, have been married for 65 years. That is inspiring. I agree. I think that's a round of applause. They have 4 children and 10 talented grandchildren. What a blessing. Today, David is going to share with us the heroic and compelling stories of 8 World War II combat veterans who fought to keep us free. Please welcome David Cohen.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Glad to be here. And as Kim said, we're going to recognize veterans today and thank them for their service. And again, it's World War II combat veterans. Let me give you some statistics about the Second World War before I get into these 8 individuals. There were 16 million US personnel in the Second World War from the United States. There were 11,200,000 in the Army. There were 4,200,000 in the Navy and 600,000 in the Marine Corps. The military deaths, unfortunately, for the United States was 405,000 killed and 600,000 wounded. The worldwide statistics that were going on during this 4-year period from 41 to 45 is there were 25 million military deaths, there were 30 million civilian deaths, 25 million people died of famine during the Second World War. Total deaths attributed to the war were 80 million individuals. Russia alone had 23 million deaths. So my purpose today is to tell the stories of these. They were 18, 19-year-old, 20, 22-year-old individuals who went into combat and personally, participated in eyewitness events that we are all really too familiar with. I spent hours and hours listening and absorbing their experiences as World War II combat veterans. I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people for my books over the years, but I've never been with a group more intriguing than these individuals. I was absorbed by their stories, and the stories went on. And many times, I had a little tape recorder with me, and they said, "You haven't turned on your tape recorder." I said, "Okay, I'll get to that in a minute." These stories would go on and on and on, and many times they would say, "Well, how long is this going to take?" And I would say, "Well, can you spend an hour with me?" When 3 hours later, I would say, "Are you tired?" They say, "No," and they kept going on because in many cases, these individuals had never told their story. And I was just overwhelmed that I would be the one that they would tell it to. So what I'm going to be able to do today in the time that we have allotted is just to give you a thumbnail sketch of their exploits, during World War II. If you're interested in the book, I brought some books with me if you want to get a book, and that would, fill in the missing gaps. Of the 8 that we're going to speak about today, 6 of them were really mortally wounded. In every case, they said to me, "I should be dead. I should have been killed in the service." 6 out of 8. It's just totally amazing. So we're going to start with, first of all, where's my friend? Milt Mapo. That's him. I don't know if you can see him, but that's him. And these are all, by the way, all but 2 of them are current pictures. And this book was completed in 2019. And unfortunately, they have all passed away. So Milt Mapo was a bosun's mate, 2nd class in the Navy. He was born in 1921, and he was in age 19. He enlisted in the Navy, 1940, and what he did at that time is that he was traveled all over the world, and I'm going to tell you his travels in a second. But the most amazing thing that he told me, he said, you know, I witnessed the sinking of the Arizona at Pearl Harbor. I said, are you serious? He said, yep. He said, I'm on a ship, and he said, it was on a Sunday, of course, it was December 7th, 1941, and he says, I'm on a ship, and we're right in the middle of Pearl Harbor, and he said, all of our officers were off duty or in Honolulu, and he said, I'm having breakfast about 8 o'clock in the morning, and he said, up on deck, and all of a sudden I look up, and I see these airplanes with this big red zero on it, and I said, what the heck is going on? And all of a sudden, I see there comes a torpedo that went right over our bow, and we said, we got to get out of here. And he said, the next thing, he said, where in the hell are our officers to lead us? But they went ashore, but he saw the sinking of the Arizona, which was, of course, the beginning of the World War II for everyone. And so they were able to go ashore, and then from that point, they were ordered to get out into the Pacific and look for submarines, and that's exactly what he did. He was on a light cruiser. Later on, what he was able to do was to travel around the Pacific, and they would lay landmines. And he said we would go through these various islands, and we just lay the landmines. And he said there would be the Japanese, and they would be on shore, and we would wave at them, and they would wave at us. And he said we're just go ahead and and do our thing. Well, it said, how terrible was this? He said, this was unbelievable. So he said, when we saw the Arizona sink, we saw the Utah sink, and we saw the Raleigh sink. And he said, we were on the USS Pringle, and we were looking for these German subs. So I said, then what else happened? He said, I was on a USS Detroit, and we're out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and here come the kamikaze planes, with 500-ton bombs strapped to the bottom of their airplane. And he said, they're shooting at us, and we're shooting at them. And he says, I'm looking up. He said, I'm on a machine gun, and here comes a kamikaze, hit our ship, split us in half, just like that. I said, well, Milt, what happened? He said, I don't know. He said, I was hooked some way to the ship. The ship was sinking. Figured I'm dead. And he said, another sailor came along, unstrapped me. I had a life vest. He was able to inflate my life vest, and some way I got thrown away enough from the ship when it sank that I was able to survive. And he says, I'm in the water for 2 or 3 hours, and along comes a little raft, American. They put me in there, and I survived. I said, this is totally, unbelievable. So I said, well, what was the deal about being in the Navy? And he said, well, you've heard the thing, join the Navy and see the world. And he said, I'm 19 years old, so I saw the world. So he couldn't imagine what was going to see and experience. So he says, well, let me tell you what I did. I said, sure, go ahead, tell me what you did. He said, well, first of all, he said, I started out at Newport, Rhode Island for basic training. I said, good. Then he said, I cruised down the Panama Canal and back up to San Diego. I said, good. Then what'd you do? He said, well, we went across the Pacific Ocean to Pearl Harbor. Then what'd you do? He said, well, we experienced firsthand the day of infamy, December 7th, 1941. We survived. So then he said, we escorted wounded servicemen back to San Francisco. Then he said, again, we went back to Pearl Harbor. And then he said, again, we headed back to San Francisco. After that, he said, I took from San Francisco a train trip to Chicago, Illinois. And then he said, I took a train trip from Chicago, Illinois to the Navy Yard at Charleston, South Carolina. And I said, then what happened? He said, well, we had a mission. And we went to the Atlantic to search for U-boats and able to escort a contingent fleet from the European theater back to Halifax, Nova Scotia. So he said, then we returned from Nova Scotia to Charleston, South Carolina. we returned trip from Charleston back to Pearl Harbor. He said, we underwent battles in Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and the Solomon Islands. And then he said, we had an excursion to Sydney, Australia. I said, are you serious? He said, this is what we did. Then he said, we witnessed the assaults at Saigon and Tinian. Those are part of of those islands in the Galapagos Islands there. And then he said, we returned back to San Francisco. Then we returned to Pearl Harbor. And then he said, we went to the Philippines. And then we screened transports to Iwo Jima. And then he said, we prepared for the assault on Okinawa. And then his ship then was destroyed by the kamikazes at sea. He was wounded. He was on a hospital ship for a lengthy surgical operation in Saipan. His hip was shattered. And to the day I saw him, for the rest of his life, he walked with a severe limp. He was airlifted back to Pearl Harbor, and he was shipped back to Oakland Naval Hospital in California. When he came back, I said, what did you do? He said, I couldn't get a job because I was disabled. And he became a warehouseman. It was the best job he said he ever got. I said, are you bitter? He said, no. He said, I was able to serve my country. I did my job. So I said, so what happened is he won the Purple Heart with a gold star. He won the Asiatic Pacific campaign with 9 stars. And he was awarded the Defense Service Medal with a star. I'm now interviewing him, and this is November of 2018. And I was sitting with him, and we're sitting down at the Mott's Military Museum in Groveport. If you've not been there and interested in any of our history of our wars, it's a great place to be. And we're sitting there in late November, and he says, I'm going to go back to Pearl. I said, what are you talking about, Milt? And by the way, he had a cold. He had the flu when we were. I said, you don't seem to be well enough. This is going to be an arduous trip to go all that way. He says, I've got to go because this will be the last hurrah for me. And he went. And he went back, and he said he was one of 20 survivors that year that went to Pearl Harbor to witness the ceremony for the sinking of the Arizona, particularly the Arizona. And he came home and passed away 2 weeks later. Such a sad story, but what a great hero. And again, all I can say is, as Milton, thank you for your service. Just a great person. The next person I want to speak with is friend Eddie Liban. Where's Eddie? Here he is, right here. Now this is an interesting guy. I'm down talking with Warren Motts, who's the founder and director of the Mott's Military Museum, and I said, who else should I be speaking with? And he said, you might want to talk to Eddie Liban. And I said, good. He said, but he won't talk to you. And I said, why won't he talk to me? He said, he doesn't talk to anybody. I said, well, do you have his phone number? He said, yeah, I got his phone number. I said, why don't you call him and see if he'll talk to me? He said, okay. So he calls, he gets him on the phone. Hi, Eddie, this is Warren. I've got a guy here who's doing a book on World War II combat veterans he'd like to talk to. He said, I'm not talking to anybody. He said, I've never told my story to anybody, and I don't care. And he hung up on him. So I said, hand me the phone. So he hands me the phone, dial the number. I said, hello. I said, hey, I'm the guy that he just talked about. I'm writing this book. Come on, I want to talk to you. He said, I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to anybody. And he said, just don't bother me. He said, that's all. I'm not telling my story. I don't care. Leave me alone. I said, okay. And boom, hangs up. I wait 5 minutes, call him back. Eddie, this is me again. That's not fair that you won't talk to me because people want to hear your story. Now, come on. And he goes, Okay. So I get off the phone, and they were marveled there. They said, you mean he really is going to talk to you? I said, that's what he said. So I said to Eddie, I said, he lived in Pickerington. I said, do you want me to come to your place? He said, no, you're not coming here. He said, I'll meet you at Mott's. I said, when? He said, tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. I said, okay. He walks in, and I'm figuring this guy is going to be the biggest grump that ever lived, and this was going to be the worst interview I've ever had. He walks in. He was the friendliest guy I've ever talked with in my life. He was so nice and so easygoing, and I never said anything like, gee, you changed. But so he comes, so he tells me his story. Well, Eddie Liebrand grew up on the south end, on Deschler Avenue in the south end of Columbus, went to South High School, had an ear infection and lost a year, couldn't go to school for a year, and so he was drafted. So he goes in the service, and he became a machine gunner in the 110th Regiment of the 28th Infantry Division, and this was all in 1944. And they boarded the ship from New York on the Queen Elizabeth and headed for Europe in late, like I said, 44. He arrived in Europe just after the Normandy invasion, which of course we know was in June of that year. Eddie's unit rounded up remaining Germans as they crossed through France. And he said, I'll just tell you, he said, France, he said, Paris is a nice place. I said, what about Paris? He said, well, we liberated Paris. He said, I was with the group that liberated Paris. And I said, well, that's nice. I'm talking to somebody who was actually there. And at one time, while they were going through France, and this was during the time, I think, of the Ardennes, he was surrounded by the German SS troops, and the Germans counteracted in the Battle of the Bulge. In 3 days, more than 2,700 of his unit were killed. They had no choice but to surrender. So I said, well, what happened? He said, here's what they did. He said, they took guys in my unit, and they lined us up, and there's a ditch, and we're on top of the ditch. There's the ditch, and over here are the guys, and they lined up machine guns, and they're going to shoot us. So he said, I nudged the guy to my left or right and said, hey, nice knowing you. He said, this is it. And he said, but before they fired, of course, some higher ranking German officer came and said, no, don't kill these guys. They're going to go to concentration camp. They're going to go to prisoner of war camp. So I said, okay. So they loaded us, and then he went to a place called Stalag 9B, where he said the conditions were horrendous. He said he couldn't believe he survived. He went in, he weighed 168 pounds, and when he was liberated 4 months later, he weighed 98 pounds. And he said at one time, one of us killed one of our guards. And he said they really got mad, and so he said we had to stand all night outside in snow and ice up to our knee caps with no shoes in the dead of winter. He said, and it's like 10 degrees below zero. And I said, you survived. He said, I don't know how we did it. So what he did, I said, well, how did you get liberated? He said, well, it had to do with a guy named Patton. He said, you ever hear of Patton? I said, yeah, I think I've heard of Patton. And he said, I was out one day. He said, I don't know, I was standing outside I call it our barracks. And he says, and I see an airplane coming towards us. And it was either British or American. And they thought that we were a German camp. And they were going to strafe us and kill us. And I knew that I was going to get killed once again. But one of our fellow prisoners in rocks had POW on the ground. And he says, as he got close, apparently he saw it. And he said, I just put my arms out like that because I figured I'm dead, I'm going to get killed. And he just flew over us, and he said, I just fell over on my back. And go, wow. And then days later, Patton came along and freed the camp. So he came back to the United States, and of course he had been in no contact with his family. And when he came back to the United States, his family said, hey, Eddie, I saw you on the news. Pathé News. Remember Pathé News used to be on the newsreels of the movie theater. What happened is that when they were liberated, Pathé News happened to be there that day and took pictures of the prisoners being freed, and they saw him, and they knew he was alive, and he came back, and it was just amazing. Well, he was basically discharged in 1945, and he came back and he worked as a machinist at Columbus Bolton Forging, which used to be down in now the Arena District. And I said to him, I said, Eddie, are you a war hero? And this is the time he really got mad at me. He said, don't ever say I was a war hero. He said, those who died are the war heroes. He said, I was just serving my country, and that's my story, you know, and I'm sticking to it. So that was Eddie Lebrand. It was just amazing. Eventually, like I said, he was married twice. Both of his wives passed away. And he lived in Pickerington. And he had a little scooter, and he used to scooter around, he said, in Pickerington. Everybody knew him. Hi, Eddie, how you doing? This little guy. And they finally, Pickerington High School gave him an honorary high school degree because he never got one from South High School. And he was so proud of that. He said, I'm a high school graduate. And unfortunately, 2-3 months ago, I see that he had passed away, but just a great human being. My next person is, where is he? Mike Perelia. Mike says to me, I'm the only person in the world that you can't pronounce my name or spell it. And I've memorized this, Bohrilla, Mike Perelia. He showed me how to do it. What a great guy. Anyway, Mike Perelia enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1943. At the time, he had two brothers that were in the service. One was in the Navy and one was in the Army and fought at Normandy. His goal was to be a pilot. He said, all I want to do is be a pilot. But he said, unfortunately, I got washed out. And so they said, you're no longer going to be a pilot. What you're going to be is a navigator. So he became a navigator. And he was on the B-17s. And this was in the 8th Air Force, the 385th bombing unit. And guess who headed that? Colonel LeMay, who was from where? Columbus, Ohio. Curtis LeMay is from Columbus, graduated from South High School. So he had a local boy at the time that, you know, became this navigator. On the crew, there were 10 men on the crew, and they were all 18 to 20 years old. He said, our pilot was pretty old. He said, he was 22 years old. These were in B-17s flying over Germany. So they flew out of England to Germany, again, the 8th Air Force. And if you flew at the beginning of their flights, if you flew 25 missions, you were excused. You could come home. Well, they were running out of planes and pilots, so they upped it to 35. So he flew 35 missions, and he has an award. He got an award, if you did that, called the Lucky Bastard Club. And he said, I am a lucky bastard. And I feel so honored. I'm an honorary member of the Lucky Bastard Club because he so deemed that and gave me a plaque. And I have the plaque for me. So I'm a lucky bastard. So if anybody ever quibbles with me, I'll tell them that's the story and that's what's going on. So, and again, Curtis LeMay was the commander of this unit bombing on B-17s Germany. Well, the British had said, well, if you're going to bomb and you're going to fly 25,000 feet, do it at night. You can't see anything anyway. Curtis LeMay said, no, we're not going to do that. Because what was happening is that Curtis LeMay was looking at various flights over Germany, and he was noticing when they looked at, they weren't hitting their targets. Well, they said to the pilots, you didn't hit the target. He said, well, I had to divert because of flak. So he said, I didn't want to get shot down. So he said, I just went off here and then I dropped my bomb over here. And he said, wait a minute. Curse me. He said, yeah, that's not the way it's going to work. He said, what you're going to do, and this is when Mike Perelia got there, he says, here's what we're going to do. They're going to be 35 of you flying your airplanes, and you're going to go in a tight formation, and you're not going to deviate for anything. He said, I don't care what the flak is. So he said, we're going to do what? He said, that's what you're going to do. And they did that. And he said, I did that for 35 missions. I said, and you didn't get killed? He said, well, no, I didn't get killed. He said, on the 19th mission, he said, the flak hit us and our engines were out and we had to land over Belgium. And he said, the pilot said to him, he said, hey, Mike, tell everybody to get ready to bail out of the airplane. So he said, all right, guys, get ready. We got to bail out. So he said, all of a sudden, he said, we don't have any engine. We keep getting lower and lower. And finally, the pilot said, bail out. And he said, bail out? We're at 500 feet. We're not going to bail out. He said, just land the damn plane. So he said, I found a place, and we went and we landed. And he said, we made a smooth landing, and no one was injured, no one was killed. So he said, I thought I had them now. They would release me. He said, I think because we had a crash. He said, we went back to England. He said, get ready, kids. You're going the next day. So that's what's happened. So I said, well, how did this thing really work? Well, let me tell you here, because I made some notes here of what they were doing when they were flying. First of all, they flew. Their planes were not pressurized at all. So they're 25,000 feet. It's 40 to 50 degrees below zero in the airplane. So he said, dressing for a mission followed the typical sequence. Regular underwear, long johns, silk socks, wool socks, standard uniform, heated suit, 4-piece, nylon flight coveralls, insulated boots, a Mae West, a flight helmet, parachute harness, flak jacket, escape packet, and a .45 caliber pistol. He said breakfast before takeoff was always memorable because mission crews were served fresh eggs any style. He said, well, it was so exciting. He said we could get any kind of eggs we wanted. I said, well, Mike, I'm sure glad you did that. Anyway, so he said the collective bond between the members of the B-17 crews were close, unlike any relationship experienced before or after World War II. Thus, the relationship between officers and enlisted men still existed. But within the crew, it was somewhat softened. All 10 men had specific tasks, and survival depended upon total discipline during combat. Critical targets in Germany were heavily defended by numerous 88 millimeter and 120 millimeter flak guns. The 88 millimeter weapons was generally regarded as the finest artillery piece in World War II. Over the targets, the Germans placed a continuous barrage as to fill hypothetical cube of airspace measuring up 1,000 feet. No B-17 survived World War II. Now Mike comes back, and I got to tell you a spooky story, and I'm telling you, this freaked me out today, but I'll get to that in a second. He comes back from the service, and he gets a master's, he goes back to college, gets a master's degree in chemistry, and got a job with a humble oil company. I was no longer in business, but they're out of New Jersey. And he was on a team that created multi-grade motor oil. I guess before there wasn't anything, but he created it, you know, the 10W30. This morning, I went to the dry cleaners, I'm coming home in the car, and I'm thinking about these various people again, and in my mind, I had just gone through Mike Perelia and said, hey, don't forget about the 10W30, and the light came on my car that says, add oil. I mean, to tell you, I mean, this is absolutely unbelievable. So I go home and say, what kind of oil do I put in? 10W30, because that fits my car, which is a Volvo. So I said, well, it was his deja vu. Is Mike up there guiding me through what I'm supposed to say about him? So it was just amazing. And greatness of these individuals is that many of them would spend time here in Columbus, down at Mott's Military Museum. And Mike would be down there every Friday from 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock. And if you walked in the door, he would greet you and say, here, sit down. What can I help you with? You got any questions? And they would go through this war, and there were always 4 or 5 of veterans down there talking about what was going on. It was just phenomenal. But that's my friend Mike. So now I want to go to a female. And this was one that I only interviewed by phone. It's the only one I didn't talk with. Well, the second one, I'll tell you about that in a minute. Lieutenant Leila Ann Morrison. Where is Leila? She's there someplace. There she is, right there. And what had happened is that I'd seen a national news article about this Army nurse in the Second World War. And I go, wow, she's really seemed like she's pretty sharp. And they said in this news article that there was a reporter for I think the Colorado Times, she lived in Colorado, had interviewed her, and I Googled the newspaper and read the article, and I said, wow, I would really like to talk with her. So I called the reporter, and I said, are you the one that interviewed Leila? He said, yeah. And I said, you think she would talk to me about her exploits in the Second World War? He said, I don't know. I said, would you call her for me? And then I could call you back. And he said, sure. I sort of got 10 minutes later, my phone rang. He said, yeah, she'd love to talk to you. So I called her and I told her, what was going on. And she said, I want to do that. So I said, well, what's your story? I knew some of it because of the articles. And she was born June 9, 1922. And she became a nurse at age 22. And of course, they were not drafting women at all. So she had to volunteer. And she graduated as a nurse. And she went into the Army Air Corps at the time. And she was doing her training. And she went to training, I think at Boy Air Force Base. And she said, we're doing our training, and there were some, the men there in the Air Force doing their training. And one night she said they had a dance, apparently. But the guys at the officers club, there were no women. They said, they knew the nurses were there, and they said, hey, you want to come over and dance? And they said, yeah, we'll come over. So she said, we were 16 of us, and we went over, and we had dinner, and we're dancing with everything. And she said there were 2 cute people there. And she said, a couple guys, she said, they're kind of cute. She said, but one guy was more cute than the other. So she said, we kept dancing and dancing, and he said, by the end of the night, he said to me, he says, hey, Leila, you want to get married? And she said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, I want to get married right now. And he said, no. She said, we can't get married. She said, we're going off to war. You're going to Europe, we're going to Europe. I wouldn't do that. You can't get married. He said, could you make me a promise? She said, what? He said, if we ever meet up again after the war, would you marry me? She said, sure, yeah, I'll marry you. Just like that, she said. And so they go off to war, so guess what happens? They come back and they meet, they got married. Anyway, happily ever after, too. So anyway, so she becomes a nurse, and she's shipped to England, and she's now preparing to go to Normandy. And this is not a lot of fun. So she goes on to Normandy with a contingent. They're going across the English Canal. And she's out in the English Canal, not on June 6th. And it's called the 5th day. On the 5th day, the 11th day, I guess a whole contingent of support people came on to Utah Beach. And she was out in the ocean for those 5 days. So she said, part of 40 nurses, one of 40 nurses, and 40 doctors were to come ashore to set up evacuation hospitals for the wounded. And she says getting to shore was one of the hardest tasks she's ever come. She said just littered with anything you think of. Dead bodies, equipment, just terrible. So we get in and we set up these evacuation hospitals. And I said, well, what happened? She said, well, you set up the hospital and we take care of the wounded and the dying and the wounded, and get them, mostly, she said, my thing was get them ready for surgery. So I said, how'd that happen? She said, we just did that day and night, 7 days a week. So she said, then once we got off of Utah Beach in Normandy, we would travel all through France, all the way up to the Ardennes, to Belgium. And she says, we were somewhere but nowhere. She said, I never knew where we were. So she said, we would work all day, get dark, take their tents down, put them on trucks, load us on, we get on the truck, go to the next thing, we sleep on the truck. Get up in the morning and do it again, do it again, do it again. I said, how could you do this? She said, David, I was 22 years old. That's how I did it. And I'm a nurse. That's my job. So she did this all the way through France. The Ardennes saw this and she says, wow, finally, the war's going to be over. I get to go home. But not so fast. And what had happened was they said there's this concentration camp that is going to be liberated and you need to go there, which was Buchenwald, which is a terrible prisoner. 56,000 deaths were going to be attributed to the atrocities at Buchenwald. So she says, we get to Buchenwald and we're right at the gates, and here again is Patton and Eisenhower. And they're knocking down the walls to get in. And so the soldiers are going in, and they said, you nurses can't come in for 3 days. And they said, why not? They said, because we don't want you to see the carnage. And so she said, we bellyached and cried and said, you got to let us do it. But they wouldn't let us in. But she said, we went in after 3 days, and she said, I couldn't believe, I've never seen anything, the inhumanity to mankind that the Germans were inflicting upon these prisoners. It's just, she said, it was just terrible. She said, I never get it out of my mind, never. So that was terrible. So I said, then what happened? She said, well, I got discharged and I came back to the United States. I'm getting discharged and there's old Charlie. Hey, Leela, how we doing? You want to get married? She said, okay. And so they got married. They had a couple of daughters. And he ran a radio station, and they lived happily ever after. And she became a part-time nurse at home. And she said, life has been good. Of course, her husband passed away, and she was still alive, but just recently passed away. So we're there after all. This interview is all over, done, and I'm ready. And she called me one day. She said, David, she said, I got a call from the French embassy. I said, you got a call from the French embassy? She said, in Washington. I said, what are you talking about? She says, well, here's what happened. She said, and I'll read what happened. On February 4th, 2009, Leela Allen Morrison was awarded the highest French Order of Merit for military and civil merits, established in 1802 by Napoleon Bonaparte and retained by all French governments and regimes. She is decorated as Knights of the Legion of Honor. This award recognizes the committed and dedication that Leela performed on the battlefields of France. Such an honor is awarded to only those individuals who showed courage and valor in the face of danger. Other American recipients include General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur, and even the United States Military Academy at West Point. Leela is a role model for all the world to admire. I said, gee whiz, this is great. And the picture that I have here and in the book, she's got her medal on. She said, do you think I really deserve it? I said, they don't just give medals like that. I said, this is like, in America, the Congressional Medal of Honor. Or the Medal of Honor is not the Congressional, I think it's the Medal of Honor today. So I said, do you have any regrets about being in the service? She says, the only regret I have is that I never knew what happened to the servicemen that I was helping. She said, I never had any contact with anybody since. She said, I helped them and they were just faces. But anyway, again, thank you for your service. The next person I want to talk is a local individual. Where is he? Donald Dunn. Donald Dunn was born in 1923 in Pennsylvania. He said, growing up, he said, I was not an athlete. I didn't do well in school. And he said, my dad and mom were worried about me because all I did was sit in my room and play the trumpet. Right, Doug? You'll see about Doug in a minute. And all he did, he said, I played the trumpet. And they said, you're not going to amount to anything. You got to do something. He said, but I wasn't interested in about anything. But he said, I did graduate, and so I decided I'd better go to college. He went to Wesleyan College. And in the spring of 1943, he knew he was going to get drafted. So he said there was an article in the college newspaper that said that the Army is going to form a brand new group, never done before, called the Mountain Division. And he goes, well, what do these guys do? And they said, well, they ski. He said, ski? He said, wow. He said, I've skied a little bit. And he said, I think I'll join, I'll volunteer, and I'll be in the Mountain Division. So he does, and he goes in, and he goes, well, that was a mistake. Because he says, I get in the service, and I go to Colorado in the wintertime, and I'm on the side of a mountain living on a snowpack, and we're skiing up and down these mountains, and I got all this equipment on, and he said, and I learned I could, how to shoot my rifle and do all that stuff. And he said, everything is going fine, except he said, I didn't think this was going to be this much fun as I thought. I thought I was going to get out of doing something, but he said, I'm right in the thick of it. So he says, what had happened is that while he was in training in Colorado, his brother, who was a pilot in the Air Corps, was lost at sea in the Pacific. And he went to his captain, and he said to the captain, he said, could I get a leave of absence? Can I go home and be with my mother because of my brother's death? And they said, well, they haven't found your brother yet. Just wait, and when they find your brother, then you can go home. But guess what? They never found his brother, lost at sea. And the other, to me, was interesting point is that after the war, this captain that Donald Dunn was reporting to went back to his home state of Oregon and became the track coach at Oregon. And one day his wife made him a waffle, and he looked at the waffle and he saw the rib, the configuration of the bottom of the waffle, and he said, you know what? That might be a good design for the bottom of a track shoe for my track team. So he went to the captain of the track team, who happened to be a fellow by the name of Phil Knight. And Phil Knight and this captain founded Nike tennis shoes or sport shoes. And they're only worth about, $100 trillion billion today. So that was good. So anyway, back to Donald Dunn. So he goes down to Texas. Now he was in the 10th Mountain Division. He said, in my luck, we're the only one activated. So we're the only ones that went over there. So he said, we're assigned to go to Italy. So he said, on December 24th, the day before Christmas in 1944, he said, we're in Italy, southern Italy. And he said, our mission was to retake the Apennine Mountains. The Apennine Mountains go from the west to the east, right above, I can't remember the town. Anyway, it's north of, anyway, I can't remember it. Take the mountains, and they're all held by the Germans. So he said, we're going to take the mountains. He said, we're going to take the mountains. He said, yeah, you're in the 10th Mountain Division. That's what you're going to do. We're going to be in the mountains. So he said, our first task, he said, that we were told, he said, you're going to take Mount Belvedere, which is the highest peak of the Apennines. So he said, this was going to be a suicide mission, because he said, we're all going to get killed. But he said, at the last moment, he said, there's other divisions going to go, you don't have to go. And they go, oh, we're in reserve. And they said, good. So he said, hey, we're doing well. So a little bit later, in April of 1844, they said there's another hill. They called it Hill 775. They said you're going to have a platoon of 40 men, and you're going to go take the hill. He said, okay. So there was always a lieutenant who was leading the charge, and so all of a sudden he said this lieutenant had figured out that they were all going to get killed, and all of a sudden he had a nervous breakdown. So the lieutenant says, I can't do that. So the captain says, all right, you can't do it. So they named another lieutenant to take his place. Well, the other lieutenant had never been in battle. And Donald said, my men, we knew that. He said, I'm a sergeant. He said, I'm not an officer. He said, well, we knew this guy was a moron. He said, he's really going to get us killed. So he said, I went to the captain. I said, hey, Captain, this isn't really going to work. He said, this is a suicide mission. He said, this guy's incompetent. He can't lead us. And he says, I think you're right. He said, you know what? He said, Donald, you're in charge. He said, no. I don't know anything about doing anything. He said, I'm just a guy. I'm just a kid from high school that played the trumpet. I'm not an athlete. I'm not a leader. I'm not anything. And they said, I'm sorry, you're going to lead your men. He said, okay. I mean, he had to do it. So he said, we trudge across the valley, 40 of us, and we go to 775. And he said, there are no trees, there's no place to hide, and we're on our bellies, and the Germans are up there, and they're shooting at us, and bing, bing, bing. And he said, I'm there, and he said, I get shot right in the shoulder, and came down to my chest, and he said, I can't look. He said, I got my uniform on, but he said, I know I'm wounded. But he said, what are you going to do? And he said, they lost 20 of half of his unit. We take the mountain, by the way. He said, we won. And he said, I don't know how we did it, but we won. Got rid of the Germans. Come back. I go back to the captain. And the captain, he said, okay. He said, we're back. And he said, we took the mountain. Everything's fine. He says, Donald, how are you doing? He said, well, I think I'm shot. He said, I'm probably going to die. He said, it kind of hurts here. And he said, well, maybe you ought to go get help. So he said, I just walked down this street, down the road, and an ambulance came, and I waved him down and said, hey, you take me to the hospital. And they took him to the hospital, and of course, he survives. And I said, are you serious? This is what happened? And I said, yeah. So I said, so how many times were you on skis? He said, never. He said, I threw the skis away. He said, we don't need them skis. We're not, we're on our bellies. So anyway, so he arrives, comes back, gets back to Columbus here on Christmas Eve of 1945. And while he was there, he won the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart for, his thing. I had known Donald Dunn for 25 years before I did this interview and never knew he was in the service. Never said a word. Never said a word anyway. And finally, after I did, I said, Donald, I've known you for all these years. I said, you've been a client of mine. I said, why didn't you tell me? He said, it was nothing. I said, what are you talking about? I said, you're a hero. He said, I'm no hero. The same thing. Those who died are heroes. No, they wouldn't admit it. So he comes back to Columbus, and you may have heard of a company here in town called Plaskolite, which is out on Joyce Avenue. Anyway, he started that company, and he was very instrumental in building the Buckeye Boys Ranch here, and he invented a tennis surface called Dynaturf, and he had the first indoor tennis club over on Joyce Avenue on the east side, the indoor tennis club. And his surface was at the U.S. Open for tennis and at the White House. And he said, very proud of the fact that his surface was the tennis court at the White House, but it didn't work. It bubbled up over the first winter, and they had to take it out. And anyway, they decided he didn't want to be in the Dynaturf business anymore, but he still had the Plaskolite. And Donald just, again, passed away a year or so ago, but truly a dynamic guy who really served our country.
David,
yes.
Could we take a quick break, just a quick 10-minute break, and then come back for the second half?
Perfect. Let's do that.
Great. Thank
Perfect.
you. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Let's have 3 more. And the next person I want to talk about is a very interesting character, and he really was a character. Where is he? Don Jakeway. John Jakeway is from Johnstown, Ohio, right down the pike. And at age 18, he enlisted in the airborne. And the airborne, he tells me, is the only branch of the service that's totally 100% volunteer. You cannot be drafted to jump out of a perfectly good airplane, he said. He said you have to be sort of nuts. But anyway, that was it. So in June of 43, he was ready for combat, and he was in Company H of the 508th Infantry Regiment. And in December of 43, he said he headed for England, and the airplanes they jumped out of were C-47s, and it comes now to D-Day. And we know D-Day, was started at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. 6 hours before would be midnight, June 5th. And what he did, he parachuted into Normandy. And the idea was, he said, we're going to parachute. Everything's going to be fine. He said, we're all land in a cluster, and we're going to then stop the supply lines for the Germans to get to the beach, and everything's going to be perfect, except it didn't work. Except he said, we jumped out of the airplanes, but we were scattered over 10 miles. So he said, we were all alone. And he said, I was really had a great jump. He said, I landed in a tree. And he said, I had to cut myself out. But what he did later, now listen to this, what he did later, he took his whole family back to that tree with his full uniform on and had a picture taken. So I said, good for you, Donald. Anyway, so he said 30 men in his company died just of parachuting. And so he said it took weeks to get back to his unit. He said they were scattered all over everywhere. And if you remember, they showed this in a movie or someplace, they had clickers. You remember they had click, 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 click. And he said, I had a clicker. We'd go click, click, and if you were another paratrooper, you'd go click, click. He said, I didn't know if the Germans had clickers or not, so he said, I threw mine away. So he said, for 10 days, I just hid in bushes and went from town to town, back alleys and everything until I was able to get back to my unit. So he says that we do that, and then we get back, and he said, now what are we going to go? He said, well, we're going to parachute into Holland. He said, great. So we go there, and his plane crashed, but he survived the crash. I said, well, good for you. So he goes from there, and at the time he was shot in the shoulder and the head, and well, he was shot in the shoulder, I'll tell you about in the head. So he said, I'm in the hospital, and they're operating, and on my shoulder. And he said, you've taken off your uniform and everything, and your helmet's laying there. And he said, the nurse came in and said, hey, by the way, Doc, there's a hole in the back of his helmet. And they said, really? He'd been shot in the back of the head and didn't know it. So he said, well, I'm laying there. They tell me this afterwards. They took out a bullet out of the back of his head. He said, I didn't even know about it. So he said, I'm now been operated on. He said, they take me out of the operating room and move me to another wing of the hospital. But it was like a stairway or something. He said, I'm no more than 50 feet away from the operating room. As soon as they take me, here came a German plane and scraped it and killed the surgeon and the nurses that just operated on me. He said, that's how close I was to being killed. So he said, I survived that. I said, well, good for you. So then they said, okay, you've now gone to Holland. Oh, I'm sorry, when he was in Holland, and this was an amazing story. He says, we're in Holland, and he says, we're landed, and we're trying to root out the Germans in these little towns in Holland to get rid of them. So we're going through, and a sniper and shooting, and everybody's shooting. He said, we get to this farmhouse, and finally we say to the people in the farmhouse, hey, by the way, you can come out, the Germans are gone. So the family comes out. And he says, the family comes out, we're standing there, and all of a sudden, here comes another man, woman, and 3 kids who had been living in the attic, who were Jewish, who they were taking care of. And I said, how long have you been in hiding? And they said, 2 years. Never had been outside in 2 years. Well, Don Jakeway is 22 years old, and one of the sons was 12 years old. He said, we're not that far apart in age. So he said, we exchanged names. Later, after the war, that 12-year-old emigrated to the United States and lived in California, and they reconnected, and Donald invited him to come back to Johnstown, and they gave talks around the various high schools about this experience that they experienced together in Holland. I said, this is amazing. And when I interviewed Jakeway, I went to his house in Johnstown, and it's a typical small house in a small town, frame house, like 2 bedrooms, kitchen, living room. They don't have any den or anything like that. Front porch, got it. So he says, come back, and he says, you can just go back to my office. I go, he has a museum in his house. He has an M16 rifle. I said, can I hold it? I said, yeah, I'm taking it off like this. I said, you carried this thing around? He said, I carried it. He said, I'm jumping out of airplanes doing this thing. And he had all flags, he had all of his medals, he had everything there. I said, this is just amazing that you were able, to survive this. And he said, well, after the thing where I wasn't killed in that surgery, he said, I got wounded again in the Ardennes. And he told me at the Ardennes, he said, if we had lost the Battle of the Bulge, if we'd lost that battle, we would have lost the Second World War. I said, well, good for us. I'm glad we did. That was just his opinion that he told me. He has in his hometown of Johnstown, there's a street named for him, Don Jakeway Boulevard, and all the parades that they would have, anything in World War II, he was always the lead guy in the parade. He was always being honored for whatever he did. And he said in his last ordeal, as far as not being killed, he says, I was wounded at the Ardennes again, second time, and he said, I'm recovering, and he says, and they're taking me back to my barracks. I'm in the Jeep, and he said, I'm with the Jeep, the driver, me, and an aide or a nurse, taking me back to my barracks, and the driver drove off the edge of the road. We tumbled down. Everyone was killed except me. He said, and here I am. He said, I really, can't, figure out what the heck is going on, But he did pretty well. He won the Bronze Wings. The Bronze Wings, the Bronze Arrowhead, Combat Stars 2, Purple Heart with Cluster, Bronze Stars 4 times, 4 Combat Battle Stars, Combat Infantry Badge, Presidential Citation, Victory Medal, Good Conduct Medal, Orange Lanyard Holland, European Theater Medal, overseas chevrons. In the foreign awards, he got the French Medal of Honor, French D-Day Medal, and the French Allied Army patch, USA, British, French, Polish. Also, Don's a member of the Ohio Veterans Hall of Fame and Ford Oval of Honor. Don Jakeway, thank you for your service. What a great person. Then we go to Frank Zacharias. Where's Frank? Fred, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry, Fred. Get mad at me. Where is he? There he is. There he is. United States Marine. He's from Wellstown, Ohio. Wellstown is Route 35 down by Jackson, Ohio. His date of birth, 1925. He was the youngest of all of them. And so he said, I grew up on a farm, family, dirt poor, had no money, nothing. And he said, lucky for me, our name was Zacharias. I said, why is that? He said, because it started with a Z. So he said, I'm in a one-room schoolhouse, and we had a potbelly stove in the winters, and they always had the stove in the back, and I'm a Z. And we sat in alphabetical order, so I got to sit next to the stove. He said that was my highlight of my education. He said we were farmers, and he said, and we had no religion. Church, God, nothing. No church, no affiliations, never discussed, didn't know anything about it. So anyway, on November 9th, 43, he becomes a United States Marine. He became a radio operator. He was at Paris Island. He was in Hawaii at Camp Tarawa. And of course, December 41, Pearl Harbor. And on January 45, they headed across to that great island called Iwo Jima. And he gets there, and he was a radio man. And he said, when you get to Iwo Jima, he said, we figured we were going to be there about 5 days. But he said that didn't work out. So he said, Iwo Jima was just an island full of Japanese, and he said, they had snipers. We had snipers, they had snipers. So he said, I'm on the radio. And they would say, there are snipers over there in that particular area. And as soon as we did it, the Japanese knew English, and they would counteract, not do it, and do something else. So we could interpret our Japanese, they could interpret us instantly. Except, he said, we had an ace up our sleeve that the Japanese didn't know about. And guess what that ace of sleeve was when it came to communication? We had the Navajo Indians, who were the wind talkers, if you can remember that. There was a movie on that. The wind talkers, and they had the Navajo language. So they trained the Navajos in what to say, and he was part of the training of the Navajos. And he said the Japanese could never figure out what the heck was going on. And he said it was great because we were able to unload our equipment that way and keep ahead, and they didn't know when we were going to do certain things because of the Navajos. He said, I think we won Iwo Jima because of the Navajo Indians. I said, okay. So they invade Iwo Jima, and all of a sudden we come to Mount Suribachi, and they raise the flag. I said, what's the big deal? He said, I was there. I said, what do you mean you were there? He said, I was standing right there when they raised the flag at Iwo Jima. I said, you were? I mean, I just talked to Milt Mapo, who witnessed the sinking of the Arizona, and I'm firsthand, like I'm there, and they're telling me they're there. And I said, well, how did it work? He said, well, how did it work? They put the flag up. He said it happened, and I think I'm correct in this, and there was a person, I'm going to say the Secretary of the Navy happened to be there that day. And the Secretary of the Navy said, that's a nice picture, but you got to get a bigger flag. Remember Jaws in the movie says, we got to get a bigger boat. He said, well, you got to get a bigger flag. So they stopped and they got a bigger flag. And they took a second picture. And of course, the second picture became the most popular worldwide picture ever taken in the Second World War. So I said, well, so what's the big deal? He said, well, I later, after the war was over, he said, I take my family to the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Virginia, and he says, there's that flag. And every 6 months, they replace the small flag with the big flag. And I'm telling my family, this is it. And he said, and he said, you know, I was there, I was within yards of that, seeing that. And he said, I'm telling the story, and all of a sudden there's like 100 people surrounding. He said, you were there? And he said, yeah, I was there. And he said, I was really proud to be able to do that. So that is amazing. So anyway, he said there was so much killing going on at Iwo Jima. He said, the snipers, and he said, what fascinated me, he said, we had a chaplain, and the chaplain would run out. He said didn't have any weapon or anything. He would run out, the chaplain, and aid the wounded, the sick and dying that are laying on the ground, and he never got shot at. And he said, what? He said, I can't believe this. Well, anyway, the rest of the story is that the regiment captain, which was Lieutenant Louis Van Bront, he said, always said to them when they got done with the battle, says, why do you think you're alive today? I don't know. Luck, I don't know. Well, anyway, so the rest of the story is that after the encounter, after one Iwo Jima, he went to to Japan with MacArthur and set up the radio communications there in that. So now he comes back. He comes back to the United States, he's going to be discharged. And the same lieutenant asked the same question again. Why are you alive today? He said, I don't know. I don't know. So he said, I'm discharged. I come home, I'm out of the service, go back to Wellston, go back. He said, my family never asked me one question about the service. What did you do? When did you do? How did you do it? What did you do it? Never, not a word. I go back and being a farmer. But he said, I kept thinking about this thing. Why are you alive today? Why are you alive today? Why didn't that chaplain get killed? So he said, I got motivated, and guess what I did? He said, I went to Oberlin College, And he said, I got a Bachelor of Divinity degree from Oberlin College, and he became a pulpit minister for 40 years. And he comes back, and I said to him, why are you alive today? And he says, to be the person I am today. He said, I finally figured it out. And I just couldn't believe it. The last person is Lieutenant Dan Carmichael, one of the most amazing human beings that I've ever known, and I did not know him well. And by the way, he had passed away in 1914. So I'd said to myself, I'm not going to go interview people who are dead. I don't mean it that way. I said, I'm only going to have people that I can speak with. But one of my dear friends says, you've got to put Danny Carmichael in your book. And he says, there's enough written material, and he says, you can talk to the family, and there's other people that knew him well, you can gather enough information. So I said, okay. Well, Danny Carmichael is a product in high school of the Columbus Academy. It happened to be, I went to the Columbus Academy, and I'd seen him at a number of alumni things after the war. Never knew anything about what he did in the war, but anyway, he was amazing. So he graduated in 1936 from the Columbus Academy, all-time great athlete. He was the first member of the Columbus Academy Sports Hall of Fame, went to Princeton University, played baseball and basketball, and was all-league in both sports there. Graduated a degree in architecture from Princeton, goes into the Marine Corps, and he becomes a Navy pilot, fighter pilot. One of his commanders was Lieutenant Butch O'Hare. We've heard of O'Hare Field in Chicago, Medal of Honor winner. He flew with him, and Danny Carmichael shot down 13 Japanese airplanes. Is one of the handful of fighter aces from the Second World War. He came back to Columbus. He became a very famous architect here in town. He designed the James Cancer Hospital and the golf club. When he was in the service, he won the Silver Star Medal with 1 Gold Star 2 times, the Air Medal with 1 Silver Star 13 times, Presidential Unit Citation Award on the USS Hornet. He was the American Campaign Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Company Medal, the Philippine Liberation Ribbon, Gold Star, American Fighter Aces Association, and Lone Sailor Award. He comes back to Columbus, Ohio after the war. He became a member of the Columbus Country Club, and they say, oh, by the way, Danny, they're going to have the Ohio Amateur Golf Championship. You ought to enter. He said, what are you talking about? He said, I haven't played golf since I was a kid. He said, I've been away for 4 years. And I said, well, it's going to be in 2 weeks. So he practices in 2 weeks, and he wins the tournament. It's just unbelievable. He's a member of the Ohio Military Hall of Fame, the Ohio Golf Hall of Fame, City of Columbus Hall of Fame, Columbus Academy Athletic Hall of Fame, City Handball Champion, City of Columbus, Ohio State Amateur Golf Champion, Ohio State Senior Golf Champion, and he qualified 4 teams for the National Amateur Championship. I mean, this guy's inhuman, you know? So at age 77, he won the Auto Racing Sports Car Club of America Racing Championships at age 77 years old. And going back after the war, he became the head test pilot for the Navy fighters' jets when the jet engines were being developed, and he approved that they were okay, and he would do that. He had the need for speed. Some people had to say about him, he said, my first recollection of Dan dates back to 1946 when I was playing basketball at the Columbus Academy. During Christmas break, we had an alumni varsity game, and Dan was playing for the alumni, most of whom had just returned from the service in World War II. All I remember about the game was that Dan dribbled the ball down the court 6 times, shot the ball from midcourt each time, and made all 6 shots. No wonder the Japanese didn't have a chance. And the last one comes from a fellow, Guy Fracasso, another dear friend and knew Dan well. And he said, one day I was practicing my handball skills at the athletic club when in walked Danny Carmichael. He asked me if I wanted to play a game. I told him I was not very good, but I could use the practice. He beat me 21-0. The game lasted 8 minutes. He walked off the court and simply said, keep practicing. Apparently he doesn't take prisoners. I loved him. So that is the story. So those are the stories of my 8 individuals. And now I would like to introduce a family friend. His family and my family go back about 100 years, maybe 95 to 100 years. Doug, who is now going to come up, is a taps player. He is a certified Army bugler. First time he ever played taps was in 1957, and has been and retired from the Army after 20 years. I think one of his highlights of his career, and maybe I'm wrong, but he played taps at Shanksville, Pennsylvania, Flight 93 in 2019. So all of you who are able to stand, he was going to play taps in honor of the 405,000 service deaths in World War II. Right? Yeah, speaker's on. Thank you. Good job.
I'd like to mention a couple things. One is that he was talking about the Battle of the Bulge, and my pastor, I'm down from Baltimore, Ohio, at the Trinity Church. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, and he was our pastor, and he died at age 42. And so the VFW down there, Post 3761, the one that's got the airplane out in front, they wanted to honor him, and so they called up the VFW called up the superintendent and said, "Does this kid weekly play taps?" And he said, "Well, yeah. Well, we don't want to use our 8 cassette tape." And nowadays, over half the taps are fake, which is kind of sad. So you got to hear it live. And I want to mention also too that I'm so proud that I have the Weeklies have a 4th generation trumpet player. He's currently at Jonathan Alder, and so he's going to try out for the, best damn band in the land. And if he makes it, that would be 3 generations. So not too many people will be able to see it. I hope he makes that. And then my high school started out in 1924. They had someone in the OSU band, and he played clarinet. And 2022, we had another individual. So over a period of 98 years, my high school, Liberty Union High School in Baltimore, Ohio, has had somebody in that OSU band, and they are the best damn band in the land.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. It was nice being with you today. Thank you for being here, and hope we can meet again. Thank you.